I'm Flavia Bellieni Zimmermann from the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Western Australia, and today we have with us the CEO of the Perth USAsia Centre, Professor Gordon Flake, and we'll be discussing today the North Korea summit. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for coming back.
Gordon, last week we have seen the attempt of President Donald Trump to seal an agreement with North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un. Can you please explain to us if there were attempts in the past to seal peace and security in the North Korea, and why those previous attempts have failed?
Well, this is an issue that I've been working closely on for over 30 years now. And on the one hand, while I'm happy to see diplomacy move forward, and certainly diplomacy is better than where we were in January of this year where we were on the cusp of a conflict, right? Where there was a highly escalatory trajectory coming out of both Pyongyang and Washington. So to use the old Churchillian phrase, jaw is better than war. At the same time, the reason we were on the cusp of war was, again, first and foremost because of the North Korean nuclear missile programs, but also because of the way the Trump administration was approaching it with the fire and fury such as the world has never known. And in that context, one doesn't tend to give an award to an arsonist who puts out his own fire, right? So I'm happy that we're back to diplomacy, but we shouldn't have been at the edge of conflict in the first place to begin with, right? Now, your question is, were there previous attempts? And President Trump would have you believe that there weren't. Like everything else in his narrative is, I alone can fix this. After 60 years of failure, only I could have a summit with Kim Jong-un. Now, the reality is obviously very, very different. Every president in the last 25 years could have, and in fact was repeatedly invited to engage with North Korea. None of them were willing to do it. Not because they were stupid or not because they didn't have the courage of Donald Trump. It's because, in fact, probably the exact opposite. They understood the consequences. And so, again, while I'm happy to see diplomacy take place, I, in the end, despite doing my utmost to have an open mind, was gobsmacked, was stunned by the summit. And in the end, the United States gave everything and got nothing. And in those terms, it's pretty easy to have a summit, right? So to explain that in a nutshell, and I don't want to go on too long here, if you look at where we were at the end of January this year, not only were we at the brink of conflict, but North Korea was under continued international isolation. They faced the most serious economic sanctions regime they'd ever faced, where we actually for the first time had very active participation from the Chinese and the Russians. And today where they are is they've completely broken out, right? They've broken out of not only international isolation, but the sanctions regime. We're learning just in the last 24 hours about the further easing of Chinese economic sanctions. There's almost no scenario in which South Korea will reassert sanctions on North Korea. So the much vaunted maximum pressure, the one kind of continuous gift that kind of went from Bush to Obama to the Trump administration is now all but gone in that process. And so the United States essentially gave up its leverage before it even went to the talks and gave North Korea what it wanted, which was the breakout I discussed, international recognition, 2 summits with the South Korean President Moon Jae-in, and now 3 summits with the Chinese President Xi Jinping, anticipated summits coming up with Putin and Abe, and of course the pièce de résistance is what we saw in Singapore, right, where Kim Jong-un was toe-to-toe, eye-to-eye as a peer of Donald Trump. So far from being the international pariah, he now has got decades worth of footage of him being seen as the great global statesman in the United States. And so what did he give up for that? Nothing. A vague commitment for denuclearization. So the agreement that actually came out, every one of the 4 points on that document had been previously agreed to by North Korea in a much more rigorous manner. In fact, you just look at the word reaffirm. Reaffirm, which occurs throughout that document, implies that it's not new. It was there before, so they gave nothing new. And in fact, there was some remarkable reverses by the United States. The United States has never before been willing to adopt the North Korean phrasing, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Because that has a very different meaning than complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear program, which North Korea, by the way, agreed to in a signed document in September 19th of 2005. It was called the September 19th Joint Statement, where they agreed to abandon all nuclear weapons and all existing nuclear programs. Agreed to. And now instead they're agreeing to this kind of ephemeral, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which implies mutual disarmament with the United States, abandonment of the alliance with South Korea, removal of the U.S. extended deterrence, or the nuclear umbrella, as it speaks. And all that was before we got to the president's even more stunning statements in the press conference after the summit, where he just kind of casually mentioned that he had agreed to cease U.S. military exercises, something that are key to training to defend not only our ally in South Korea, but Japan and the region writ large. And not only did he agree to stop the training, he agreed to the North Korean phrasing of them, them being war games and focus on cost, and called them provocations. And somehow he's calling the U.S. military the provokers in this regard. And then a step further, he indicated that he's seriously thinking about pulling U.S. troops out of the peninsula. And all this done without coordination with his own Defense Department, let alone allies like Korea, Japan, and Australia. So having said that, I'm deeply concerned. And my concern has only grown in the last week in the evidence that suggests that the president has gone home and kind of washed his hands and said, peace in our day, we've finished, everything is done, and nothing has even started. so yeah, I, like most people who watch this closely, are more than a little bit disturbed by the results thus far. Sorry about that, long answer.
No, that's fascinating, Gordon. Thank you very much. And yeah, we are living through interesting times. So, Gordon, if you could explain a little bit more to us, because you are unraveling the implications also of the North Korea summit. If you could please explain to us how the summit impact American interests in the region.
Well, look, I think the most underreported story from the summit is the implications of how the summit was carried out, the processes on America's alliance relationships in the region. And remember, President Trump went straight from a disastrous G7 meeting in Quebec to Singapore. A G7 meeting where obviously there was, the most discord that we've ever seen in 70 years between the United States and its North Atlantic Treaty allies, right? And in fact, the U.S. went so far as to refuse to use the term rules-based order, which is an article of faith for Australia, and heaped incredible criticism upon one of the United States' closest and most long-standing allies, Canada, days before heaping praise upon Kim Jong-un, a man who, remember, killed his own half-brother just within the year using a banned nerve agent in an international airspace, and then that's above and beyond all the other areas about the regime, right? So, that process was doubled down on in Singapore, where again, the back and forth of the summit itself, will it happen, won't it happen? I was attending the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore just a couple weekends ago, and the French defense minister got up and made a joke about it, Summit's on, it's off, it's on, it's off. And everybody in the room laughed, but there's actually something quite serious about this, right? The American, policy-making process has now become a joke, right? And the thing that people don't report on that is that not only was that kind of, fickle in the most charitable sense of the word, but it was uncoordinated, right? So our allies in Japan and South Korea were stunned to find it canceled, and equally stunned to find it rescheduled without coordination. And likewise, as I indicated coming out of the problem, stunned to find U.S. unilateral decisions which have direct bearing on Australia's defense, Japan's defense, South Korea's defense, announced in an uncoordinated manner. So if I'm sitting in Seoul or Tokyo or Canberra these days, I am deeply concerned, because the alliance relationship historically always meant close coordination between allies. So that is certainly one of the regional implications of it. Now, again, to be fair, I certainly would be better, I'm certainly more pleased with that uncertainty and those difficulties than I was with the risk of a US-led, uncoordinated strike on North Korea, right? So, so if we're going to deal with the United States failing to coordinate with allies, I'd rather have them provoking ambiguity and peace than provoking conflict. But either way, the underlying problem highlights one of the real challenges with this administration.
Thank you very much, Gordon. And Gordon, if you could unpack a little bit more, also the implications of the North Korea summit and the processes, as you were explaining, that were unilateral and not following traditional coordination within American allies in Chinese influence and power in our region.
There's been several good pieces of analysis written in the intervening week and a half now that suggest that the real winner out of this entire process is China, right? Because China essentially got what they wanted. China had previously proposed to the United States a freeze-for-freeze deal. They had proposed that just to get us away from the crisis we faced late last year during the fire and fury stage, right? That the U.S. agreed to freeze its military exercises, and the North Koreans would agree to freeze their missile tests and their nuclear tests, right? Well, at the time, the United States rejected that out of hand. Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, called that proposal insulting. Why? Because on the one hand, North Korea is pursuing a missile program and a nuclear program in direct contravention of 6 different sets of UN Security Council sanctions resolution. The very definition of kind of a rogue state in violation of international law, standards and norms and its own agreements, right? So that's one hand. The United States conducting of military exercises with its ally partner in the face of those North Korean actions is by the definition something which is legally acceptable, a standard, a norm. While the North Koreans may not like it, the United States is doing exercises in a sovereign country, which permits and actually wants those exercises as an ally of the United States. There's nothing remotely illegal about them, right? So to freeze one for the other is inherently, an unequal trade, right? And one which we were assured a month ago by the North Koreans that was acceptable to them. They were okay. They had no problem. They told the South Koreans they understood military exercises. And yet, and again, in a flash of what he thought was brilliance, President Trump agrees to the Chinese freeze-for-freeze deal. So how does that leave our allies in South Korea? How does that leave American defense planners who are responsible for making sure that U.S. troops, some 22,000 in the Korean Peninsula right now, are prepared? And because there is a level of kind of moral responsibility for military leaders to make sure that your troops are prepared, you've got the best possible defense. And if you can't exercise, and all that's required in that process, which is an ongoing process, all of a sudden, what are we doing there, right? As a U.S. military leader, do you want your troops there if they can't, do the necessary planning for their own processes? So again, China wins on that front. China, again, Kim Jong-un just earlier this week took his 3rd trip up to meet with Xi Jinping. So what had been, and candidly what Donald Trump inherited, which was closer than ever coordination between the U.S. and China in responding to North Korea, particularly in response to North Korea's missile and nuclear tests, is now completely gone, right? At this point, we would like to hope that the summit was just the start of a new negotiation with the United States, but it's quite clear the summit was kind of the end of the process. The North Koreans are now fully back in good graces with China. The sanctions are broken, the pressure are gone, and North Korea at this point has to do nothing. They're fait accompli, and nuclear power and the international coalition against that conclusion is largely broken and gone. So.
Thank you very much, Gordon. And wrapping up our interview, Gordon, if you could also explain to us how Japan might be perceiving this new world order that seems to be unfolding and American reposture in the region, and the fact that Donald Trump is willing to stop the military exercises in the Korean Peninsula.
Now, Japan has, in many respects, for the last 4 months, been the real outlier, right? They were directly targeted in North Korean rhetoric by North Korea's missile program and by their nuclear program. And they feel a direct sense of vulnerability from North Korea. On top of that, Japan has their own deeply sensitive domestic issues surrounding the status of Japanese citizens which were abducted by North Korea. And in the past 2 decades, careful coordination with Japan and the United States was because the centerpiece of almost all diplomacy that took place, right? Because, look, I have long referred to North Korea as the hole in the Northeast Asian donut, right? And my view, 10 years ago and 15 years ago was, as fascinating as North Korea is, the United States' strategic interests in the region were the peace and stability of its allies, Japan and Korea, and good relations with China. In other words, the most economically vibrant region in the world, that's what matters. North Korea, again, is the hole in the donut. We've got to deal with it, but that's not where our focus should be, right? And so I have long been supportive of an approach that prioritized alliance relations with Japan and South Korea over resolution of North Korea. Because any resolution has to be done in a way that's in the interest of our near neighbors. I don't see evidence of that core understanding in this administration. And so Japan at this point is extremely anxious. Again, as I was saying earlier, Prime Minister Abe was flying to a meeting with the Russian President Putin. While he was in the air, the news breaks that the U.S. has canceled the summit. Stunning him, right? No coordination, no phone call. And it was news that the Japanese welcomed. And they put out a said, we are strongly supportive of this because they were deeply ambivalent about the summit to begin with. And then 3 days later, you flip again and the summit's back on, again without coordination, undercutting Japan, which had supported the previous decision, right? So if you're Japan right now, you've got deep anxiety that your interests are not taken into account, right? That the abductee issue hasn't been raised, that your immediate security concerns haven't been raised. And a situation that we have right now where the American president has declared victory, but there's no change on the ground, does nothing to alleviate Japan's concern. And if I could add, since we're the Australian Institute for International Affairs here, if I could add a final note about Australia on this. Look, for a long time, North Korean propaganda has been strongly suggesting that Australia has nothing to do with this. It's a long ways away. Now, I know there are school children down here in Rockingham that during the height of the threats of North Korean missiles were worried whether or not they might be targeted or not, right? That's probably stating a little bit too much. But the reality is that Australia has direct security interests in how this issue plays out. Because, in a nutshell, Australia has decided to guarantee its own national security by 2 primary means. Number 1, close alliance relationships with the United States. And number 2, reliance on the rules-based global order. Again, the Australian mantra. What does that mean? That means that even though Australia is in every respect more advanced than North Korea, technologically, scientifically, in its diplomatic relations, as an economy, etc., Australia has decided not to pursue missiles, though it could. ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. It's decided not to pursue nuclear capability, although it could and would certainly be more acceptable than North Korea in that pursuit. Why? Because Australia has believed that its own security is better guaranteed by that rules-based order. And so what North Korea has been doing over the recent years in its missile tests and nuclear tests is a direct threat to Australia's own national security interests. Because if North Korea can break away and get away with it, why can't South Korea? Why can't Japan? Why can't Taiwan? Why can't Vietnam? Why can't the Philippines? Why can't Indonesia? And all of a sudden you end up with a region that is very different than the one which Australia wants and needs, right? And so that's why, North Korea essentially declaring victory, saying, look, we've tested our nuclear weapons 6 times, we have a deterrent. We've tested our missiles, we've got an ICBM, they've got range to the United States, we're done. We've got it, we are a nuclear power, and we must be accepted as one. And the Trump administration essentially de facto recognizing him as such, right? Without any further consequences. At this point, North Korea just has to sit back and wait. They don't need to do any further provocative actions. And that's the situation where, again, while better than an immediate conflict, is deeply unsettling for Japan's national interest and for Australia's national interest.
So Gordon, you're telling us that one of the main implications of the Korean summit might be a militarization of our region.
Well, I hope that's not the case. I mean, obviously this is a story that's had many twists and turns, and it's not over yet. One of the core questions I have for myself is does Kim Jong-un want more? You know, and if he wants more, he has to give more. So there's still a scenario in which this ends well. South Korea is committed to it. There'll be pressure, and you know, the Trump administration won't always be around, right? And clearly, countries like Japan and South Korea and Australia continue to have a lot of vested interest in the system as it is right now. But right now, that system is under great strain and threat. Not just from what we thought about for the last 25 years, the rise of China, but also from increasing, shall we say, doubts about kind of the United States' role in this process, at least for the interregnum. So, you know, we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you very much, Gordon.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Fascinating talking to you.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. For more information, please visit our website www.internationalaffairs.org.au. Thank you.